Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is right now. That's how YouTube keeps sending you more chilling stories like this. And now, let the night begin with Story 1. The staff knew about the hidden screening room. When I finally found a way inside, I discovered a fully operational screening room with fresh popcorn still warm in the seats and a guest log dated from the night before. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, seeing dates going back months, all recent. Then I reached the last entry, written in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow looked familiar. It was my own name, signed for yesterday's date, but I'd never been in this room before in my life. That's when I heard the door click shut behind me, and the projector started rolling. I took the night janitor job at the Paramount Theater because I needed the money. Student loans were crushing me, and cleaning an old downtown cinema from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. paid better than anything else I could find with my schedule. The building dated back to 1924. All Art Deco details and faded velvet seats, the kind of place that probably had real character back when movies were still magic. My first day, the manager Derek walked me through the building. Tall guy, probably in his 50s with tired eyes that suggested he'd been dealing with this place longer than he wanted to. He handed me a heavy ring of keys and went through the routine, mopped the lobby, vacuumed the theaters, empty trash, clean bathrooms, basic maintenance stuff. Nothing complicated. "You can access every room in the building with these," he said, rattling the keys. He led me down to the basement level, past the storage areas and utility rooms, to a heavy wooden door at the end of a narrow hallway. The door had no number, no label, just old brass hardware that looked original to the building. "This one stays locked. It's just old storage anyway, sealed off years ago. Foundation issues." I didn't think much about it at first. Every old building has rooms that get forgotten, sealed off, abandoned. I had plenty of other areas to keep me busy during my 8-hour shifts. The Paramount had 4 theaters, a large lobby, offices upstairs, and the basement level with storage and the boiler room. More than enough to fill my nights. The work itself was straightforward but oddly peaceful. There's something calming about being alone in a large, quiet building at night. I'd put in headphones and work my way through the theaters systematically, cleaning up the remnants of people's evenings out. Popcorn kernels, sticky soda spills, the occasional lost earring or wallet that I'd leave at the box office for the morning staff. It was during my 3rd week that I first heard something from behind that basement door. I was down in storage restocking cleaning supplies around 2 a.m. when I heard it. Muffled dialogue like voices having a conversation. Then laughter. Not loud, but distinct enough that I stopped what I was doing and listened. It sounded like it was coming from the sealed room, but that was impossible. Derek had been clear that it was just empty storage locked away for good reason. I walked over and pressed my ear to the door. The voices were clearer now. It sounded like a movie playing, complete with soundtrack. I could hear the tinny quality of speakers, the way dialogue sounds when it's projected in a large space, but that made no sense. There was no electricity running to that room, no equipment, nothing. I tried the door handle anyway, locked solid. I went through every key on my ring, but none of them fit. Derek had said I could access every room except this one, and he'd meant it. The sound stopped after about 20 minutes. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, or maybe it was echoes from one of the upstairs theaters bleeding through the old building's walls and floors. Sound could travel in weird ways through a place this old, but it happened again the next night. Same time, around 2 a.m., same muffled movie dialogue and audience reactions. This time I was sure it was coming from behind the locked door. I even put my ear directly against the wood and could feel slight vibrations like speakers were playing on the other side. I didn't say anything to Derek or the morning staff. What was I supposed to tell them? That I was hearing ghost movies in the basement? They'd think I was losing it, or worse, they'd think I was getting high on the job or something. The third time it happened, I decided to investigate properly. I brought a flashlight and spent time examining the door and the surrounding walls. The door itself was solid oak, probably original to the building, with a heavy deadbolt that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. But when I checked the frame more carefully, I noticed something odd. There were fresh scuff marks on the floor near the door, not obvious ones, but the kind of light scratches you'd see if a door was being opened regularly. And when I looked closer at the lock, I could see tiny metal filings like someone had been working on it recently. That's when I realized Derek might have lied to me about the room being sealed off permanently. Over the next week, I started paying more attention to the other staff members' behavior. Derek always seemed nervous when I mentioned anything about the basement, deflecting questions and changing the subject quickly. The assistant manager, Lauren, got visibly uncomfortable when I asked about the building's history. Even Marcus, who ran the concession stand and had worked there for 3 years, clammed up whenever I brought up the lower level. They all knew something about that room that they weren't telling me. I started varying my routine, going down to the basement at different times during my shift to see if I could catch whatever was happening. Most nights, nothing. But occasionally, always around the 2 a.m. hour, I'd hear that same muffled movie playing behind the locked door. One night, I heard something different. Instead of dialogue, it sounded like people talking to each other. Not actors in a film, but real conversations. Casual, friendly chatter like you'd hear in a theater lobby before a show starts. Then someone laughed, and I could swear I recognized the voice. It sounded like Marcus from concessions. That Friday, I stayed later than usual and watched from the storage room. Around 1:45 a.m., I heard footsteps on the stairs. Multiple people trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding in an old building with creaky floors. I turned off my flashlight and hid behind some stacked boxes. Derek came down first, followed by Lauren and Marcus. Derek had a different set of keys in his hand, ones I'd never seen before. He unlocked the mysterious door like he'd done it 1,000 times, and all 3 of them went inside. The door closed behind them, but I could hear their voices clearly now, along with the sound of equipment starting up. They were running a movie screening, in a room they'd told me didn't exist. I waited until I heard the film start playing, then crept closer to the door. Through the keyhole, I could see light flickering like a projector was running. I heard the opening credits music of what sounded like an older film, maybe something from the 70s or 80s. Then I heard more voices join Derek, Lauren, and Marcus. They weren't alone in there. I counted at least 6 different people talking quietly among themselves as the movie played. All staff members I recognized from different shifts. They were having some kind of secret screening in a room they'd specifically told me was off limits and unused. But why lie about it? Why not just tell me they used the basement room for employee movie nights? It seemed like a harmless enough thing, even kind of cool, unless there was something about these screenings they didn't want me to know. I listened for almost an hour before they started coming out. I barely made it back to my hiding spot before Derek emerged, followed by the others in small groups. They were all quiet, subdued, not like people who just enjoyed a fun movie together. They looked serious, almost grim. After they left, I tried the door again, still locked tight. But now I was determined to find out what was really going on in that room. It took me another week of careful observation to figure out their system. The screenings weren't random. They happened every few nights, always starting around 2 a.m., always with the same core group of staff members. And they always brought other people with them, employees from different departments who rotated in and out. I started noticing things about the staff members who participated. They'd been working at the Paramount longer than most, some of them for years. and they all had this odd way of looking at me during my shift, like they were evaluating whether I belonged or not. Then Marcus approached me on a Tuesday night about 3 weeks after I'd first heard the sounds from the basement. He asked, leaning against the concession counter while I emptied trash bins. "Fine," I said. "Yeah, Derek's good about keeping things simple for new people." I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. "Well, let's just say the Paramount has some history, some traditions." He was fishing for something, but I wasn't sure what. "Maybe you'll find out soon," he said, and walked away. 2 nights later, Derek approached me near the end of my shift. He seemed different, more relaxed than usual, almost friendly. "Tyler, you've been doing good work," he said. "Really reliable, professional." "Thanks," I said, not sure where this was going. "There's something I want to show you." He pulled out that different set of keys I'd seen him use before. My heart started racing, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. He led me down to the basement, straight to the locked door. "I may have misled you about this room," he said, fitting a key into the lock. "It's not sealed off. We use it for special screenings." The door opened and I followed him inside. The room was incredible. It was a fully functional movie theater, smaller than the ones upstairs but beautifully maintained. Maybe 40 seats arranged in rows, a professional projection booth in the back, speakers mounted throughout. The decor matched the rest of the building's Art Deco style, but everything looked recently restored. "This is the original screening room," Derek explained. "When the Paramount opened in 1924, this was where they'd preview films for critics and special guests before the public screenings upstairs." It was impressive, but something felt off. The room was too well maintained for something that was supposedly just used for occasional employee events. The projection equipment looked expensive and frequently used. And there was something else, something that made the hair on my neck stand up. As we walked toward the back of the theater, I noticed a small table near the entrance with a guest book lying open. I could see names and dates written in different handwriting. Derek was talking about the room's history, but I wasn't really listening. I was staring at the guest book, at the most recent entries. The dates went back months, but they were all recent. 2 or 3 entries per week, sometimes more. All signed by employees I recognized, along with other names I didn't know. The handwriting was different for each entry, but something about the most recent signature caught my eye. It looked like my handwriting, but it wasn't just similar, it was identical. The same way I formed letters, the same spacing, the same pressure, and the name signed was Tyler Morrison. My name, but the date was from yesterday. And I'd never been in this room before in my life. "Derek," I said, my voice coming out strangely tight. He turned around and saw me staring at it. His expression changed immediately, becoming guarded and tense. "Just a record of who attends our private screenings," he said. "But my name is in here, from yesterday." Derek walked over and looked at the book. When he saw the entry I was pointing to, his face went pale. "That's impossible," he muttered. Instead of answering, he quickly closed the guest book and ushered me toward the exit. "We should go. The regular one. Every few nights we show films down here." We were back in the hallway now, and Derek was locking the door behind us. But I could hear sounds from inside the room, the same sounds I'd been hearing during my shifts. Equipment starting up, people talking quietly, chairs creaking as an audience settled in. He turned to face me, and his expression was genuinely worried. "Tyler, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Some things about this building are complicated. The basement screening room has been operational since 1924, and it's always been used for special presentations. But over the years, those presentations have become... The films we show down there aren't regular movies, they're recordings of things that happen in this building. Security footage mostly, but edited together into longer presentations." That made no sense. "These recordings are different. I stared at him. The guest book entries, the signatures, they're from people who attended screenings of events that occurred in the future. I know how it sounds, but Tyler, your name is in that book because you're going to attend a screening. Soon. The hallway felt like it was tilting around me. This is crazy. Not a time machine. Just recordings that show events slightly out of sequence. The building has always had this property. I heard the door click behind him even though Derek hadn't touched it. The lock had engaged on its own. And from inside the room I could hear the projector starting up. Derek, I want to leave. I can't let you do that, he said quietly. You've seen too much, and your name is already in the book. The order of events. I tried to push past him, but Derek grabbed my arm. He was stronger than he looked, and his grip was firm. Tyler, I'm sorry. I know this is frightening, but everyone who works here long enough eventually has to attend a screening. Behind us, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Other staff members were arriving for whatever was about to happen. Marcus appeared first, followed by Lauren and 3 other employees I recognized from different shifts. They all looked at me with expressions of sympathy mixed with resignation. Welcome to the real Paramount, Marcus said. Derek opened the door to the screening room and I could see the projector was already running. On the screen was security footage of the lobby upstairs, but the timestamp showed next week's date. I watched myself walking across the lobby, stopping at the concession stand, talking to Marcus about something I couldn't hear. That conversation happens next Tuesday, Derek said. You'll ask Marcus about the screening room and he'll tell you the truth. They guided me into the theater and I found myself sitting in the 3rd row, surrounded by co-workers who all seemed to know exactly what was happening. The guest book was passed around and when it reached me, Derek pointed to the signature line for today's date. Sign it, he said. My hand was shaking as I wrote my name, but the handwriting looked exactly like the signature I'd seen from yesterday's date. Like I'd done this before, even though I knew I hadn't. On screen, the security footage continued. I watched myself having conversations I'd never had, walking through parts of the building I'd never visited, doing things during my night shifts that I couldn't remember doing. Then the footage jumped to what looked like earlier tonight. I watched myself discovering the basement room, talking to Derek, signing the guest book, but the camera angle was from inside the screening room, filming us through the open door. I whispered. The building records everything, Lauren said softly. Past, present, and future. On screen, I watched myself sitting in this exact seat, asking that exact question. The footage kept rolling, showing me leaving the building at the end of tonight's shift, coming back tomorrow night and continuing to work as if everything was normal. But in the future recordings, I looked different. Tired, worried, constantly checking over my shoulder like I was afraid of something. I asked, You keep working here, Derek said, and every few nights you attend screenings. You can't. Once you've signed the guest book and attended a screening, you're part of the building's timeline. I watched more footage of my future self, seeing myself gradually become like the other staff members, resigned, careful, aware of something I couldn't quite understand yet. I asked Derek. 15 years, he said. Marcus has been here for 8, Lauren 6. We all started the same way you did, just looking for a job. People who aren't compatible with the screening room don't last long. They quit within a few weeks, usually without knowing why. The footage on screen jumped forward several months. I watched my future self training a new employee, someone I didn't recognize, explaining the basic cleaning routine and carefully avoiding mention of the basement room, just like Derek had done with me. I asked. This is everyone's life who works here long enough, Marcus said. I looked around the theater at their faces. They weren't happy, but they weren't miserable either. They seemed to have accepted their situation, found a way to live with the knowledge that their futures were already recorded and playing in a basement theater. What if I try to change things? You can try, Derek said, but the building has ways of correcting deviations. On screen, I watched my future self having this exact conversation, asking these same questions, getting these same answers. The screening ended and the lights came up. Everyone began filing out quietly like they'd just attended a regular movie. Derek handed me back my keys and patted my shoulder. "Your shift ends in 2 hours," he said. "Finish up the regular cleaning, then go home and get some sleep." I found myself walking back upstairs, mechanically completing my remaining tasks while my mind tried to process what had just happened. I mopped the lobby, emptied the last few trash bins, and locked up the building just like I had every night for the past month. But now I knew the building was watching me, recording everything I did, playing it back for an audience of employees who were trapped in the same cycle I'd just joined. I drove home in my car, went to bed in my apartment, and tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of elaborate hazing ritual or practical joke. But the next night, I came back to work like the recordings had shown I would. And the night after that, and every night since. I still clean the Paramount Theater from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I still have keys to every room in the building except one. And every few nights, I attend screenings in the basement where I watch recordings of my future self continuing to work here, month after month, year after year. The guest book now has my signature on dozens of pages, confirming attendance at screenings of events that haven't happened yet but inevitably will. I've watched myself train new employees who don't last and train others who eventually sign their own names in the book. I've seen recordings of conversations I'll have next week, next month, next year. I know what I'll say, how I'll react, what decisions I'll make. And I've learned that trying to change those predetermined events only results in minor variations that lead to the same outcomes. The building chooses who stays and who goes, Derek told me, and apparently I'm someone who stays. I don't know how long I'll be working here. The recordings show me continuing for years, gradually becoming like Derek and the others, resigned to maintaining a sequence I don't fully understand, attending screenings of a future that's already been written. But I keep coming back every night because the guest book has my signature on pages dated months from now. And I've learned that the Paramount Theater always collects on its contracts. Sometimes during quiet moments in my shift, I'll hear sounds from the basement screening room even when no one else is in the building. The projector running, an audience laughing quietly at something on screen, the soft rustle of people settling into their seats for another presentation. And I know that somewhere in that room, a recording is playing of me sitting in the third row, watching footage of myself asking Derek what happens next, already knowing the answer because I've seen it all before. Story 2. I saw myself on the security footage. I never went into that theater. I was standing in the security office the entire time, watching myself on the monitor. But there I was on screen, walking through the lobby at 11:47 p.m., entering Theater 4 and sitting down in the back row. I watched the figure that looked exactly like me sit motionless in the dark for 40 minutes. Staring at the blank screen, the timestamp kept rolling while I stood frozen in the office, afraid to look away from the monitor. When I finally got the courage to check Theater 4 in person, the seat was still warm. Working the box office at the Meridian Cinema wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills while I figured out what to do with my life after college. Small town theater, 6 screens, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the biggest excitement is when they get a new release the same week as the multiplex across town. I worked the evening shift, selling tickets from 4 p.m. until closing at midnight. After the last show let out, my routine was simple: count the register, tidy up the lobby, and do a final security check before locking up. The security check was the most important part. I had to review the camera footage to make sure the building was completely empty before I set the alarm and went home. The theater had cameras in every public area, lobby, hallways, all 6 theaters, even the bathroom's entrance areas. The manager, Carol, was paranoid about people sneaking in for free shows or hiding in the building after hours. She'd been burned before by teenagers who thought it would be fun to spend the night in a movie theater, and now she required a complete visual sweep every night before closing. I'd been doing the job for about 6 weeks when something strange showed up on the security footage. It was a Tuesday night in October, quiet even for our little theater. We'd only sold maybe 30 tickets total for all the evening shows, and the last customers had left by 11:30. I was going through my usual closing routine when I sat down at the security desk to review the cameras. The security system recorded everything on a loop, keeping the past 4 hours accessible for review. I'd fast forward through most of it, just making sure there weren't any obvious problems or people lingering where they shouldn't be. Usually took about 10 minutes to scan through everything. That night, I was watching the lobby camera footage when something caught my eye. At 11:47 p.m., I saw someone walk through the front doors and cross the lobby toward Theater 4. Nothing unusual about that except for one thing: we'd been closed for 17 minutes. The doors were locked, the lights were dimmed, and I was the only person in the building. I rewound the footage and watched it again. A figure entered through the main doors, walked purposefully across the lobby, and disappeared down the hallway toward Theater 4. The timestamp clearly showed 11:47 p.m., which was impossible because I'd locked those doors myself at 11:30. But the really disturbing part was what the figure looked like. It looked like me. Same height, same build, same clothes I was wearing that night. Khaki pants and the stupid red polo shirt with the theater's logo. Same walk, same posture, even the same way of running my hand through my hair when I was thinking about something. I stared at the monitor, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was just someone who resembled me from a distance, though that seemed unlikely in a town where I knew pretty much everyone who came to the theater regularly. Or maybe there was a glitch in the timestamp, and this footage was from earlier in the evening when the building was still open. But I checked the earlier footage, and I could account for my whereabouts during the entire evening. I'd been at the box office until 11:30, visible on the lobby camera the whole time. There was no period where I'd left my post and walked through those doors. I switched to the Theater 4 camera to see what had happened next. The figure, the person who looked exactly like me, had indeed entered Theater 4. I could see him clearly now, sitting in the back row, seat 12. Just sitting there staring at the blank screen. The movie had ended at 11:15, so there was nothing playing, no lights, just the emergency exit signs casting a dim glow over the empty seats. And this person who looked like me sat there for 40 minutes without moving. I fast-forwarded through the footage, watching the timestamp roll by. 11:50, 12:15, 12:30. The figure never shifted position, never checked a phone, never did anything. Just sat perfectly still in the dark facing the blank screen. At 12:27 p.m., 3 minutes before I was watching this footage, the figure stood up and walked out of the theater. I quickly switched to the lobby camera, but there was nothing. No one emerged from the Theater 4 hallway. No one crossed the lobby. No one left through the doors. The person had simply vanished. I sat in the security office, staring at the monitors, trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding, and I had that weird feeling you get when something is fundamentally wrong with reality, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is. I decided to check Theater 4 in person. The walk from the security office to Theater 4 took about 2 minutes through the dimly lit building. I had my flashlight and my keys, and I told myself I was just being thorough in my security check. Nothing more. Theater 4 was dark and quiet, exactly as it should be. I walked down to the back row, to seat 12 where I'd seen the figure sitting. The seat looked normal, nothing obviously out of place, but when I put my hand on the seat cushion, it was warm. Not hot, but distinctly warm, like someone had been sitting there recently. The fabric still held body heat, as if the person had gotten up just minutes before I arrived. I checked my watch, 12:35 a.m. According to the security footage, the figure had left the theater at 12:27. The timing matched perfectly. I stood in the empty theater, shining my flashlight around the rows of seats, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe the heating system was malfunctioning and creating hot spots. Maybe the seat always felt warm because of its position near a heating vent. Maybe I was imagining things because I was tired and freaked out by the strange footage. But I knew what I'd felt, and I knew what I'd seen on the security cameras. Someone who looked exactly like me had been in this theater after closing, sitting in this exact seat, and that someone had disappeared without leaving through any of the monitored exits. I finished my security check quickly and got out of the building as fast as I could. I drove home trying to convince myself it was all some kind of technical glitch or optical illusion. Something that would make sense in the morning when I wasn't tired and on edge. But the next night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I found myself checking the Theater 4 camera more frequently during my shift, looking for anything unusual. I started paying attention to every customer who entered that theater, trying to see if anyone resembled me or behaved strangely. But the evening passed normally, and when closing time came, I approached the security review with dread. Nothing unusual showed up on that night's footage. Everything looked normal and boring, exactly like it was supposed to. But 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, the timestamp showed 11:52 p.m., and the figure appeared on the lobby camera just like before. Same clothes, same appearance, same purposeful walk toward Theater 4. I watched, fascinated and terrified, as my apparent doppelganger entered the theater and took a seat. This time, I decided to confront whatever this was immediately. I left the security office while the figure was still visible on the Theater 4 camera, moving as quickly and quietly as I could through the building. If someone was playing an elaborate prank on me, I was going to catch them in the act. If there was some kind of technical explanation, I'd figure it out. But when I reached Theater 4, it was empty. I checked every row, every seat, every possible hiding place. The theater was completely vacant, and all the seats were cool to the touch. But when I returned to the security office, the footage still showed the figure sitting in the back row, motionless and patient. I was looking at a recording of someone in a place where no one existed. Over the next several weeks, the appearances became more frequent. Not every night, but often enough that I started to dread my closing routine. Sometimes the figure would appear in Theater 4, sometimes in Theater 2 or Theater 6. Always the same behavior. Enter after closing, sit alone in the dark theater, stare at the blank screen for 30 to 40 minutes, then disappear. And it always looked exactly like me. I started taking photos of myself at work, trying to compare them to the figure on the security footage. The resemblance was uncanny, not just similar, but identical. Same facial features, same body language, same unconscious gestures. It was like watching a recording of myself, except I knew I wasn't doing any of these things. I considered telling Carol about the problem, but what was I supposed to say? That I was appearing on security cameras in places I'd never been? That someone who looked exactly like me was sneaking into the theater after hours and sitting in empty rooms? She'd think I was losing my mind, or worse, that I was trying to cover up for letting someone into the building inappropriately. Instead, I started documenting everything. I took notes about when the appearances happened, which theaters were involved, how long the figure stayed. I made copies of the security footage, burning them onto DVDs that I took home and studied frame by frame. The more I analyzed the recordings, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just someone who resembled me. The figure moved exactly like me, had the same slight limp in my left leg from an old soccer injury, even scratched his nose the same way I did when I was concentrating. But there were subtle differences that became more apparent the longer I watched. The figure's posture was slightly different, straighter, more confident than mine usually was. His facial expression was harder to read, more neutral and detached, and his eyes, when I could see them clearly on the camera, looked somehow older, more tired than mine felt. It was like watching a version of myself from a different timeline or dimension. Someone who was me but had lived a slightly different life. The appearances continued for 2 months. I started calling in sick on nights when I couldn't handle the stress of wondering whether my doppelganger would show up on the cameras. But even when I wasn't there, Carol mentioned that the morning staff would sometimes find Theater 4 or other theaters with inexplicably warm seats, as if someone had been sitting there overnight. Then one night in December, something changed. The figure appeared on the lobby camera as usual, but this time, instead of heading to one of the theaters, he walked directly toward the security office, toward me. I watched on the monitor as my doppelganger approached the office door, moving with that same purposeful stride I'd seen dozens of times before. But now he was coming to the one place I couldn't avoid confronting him. I stood up from the security desk, my heart hammering, and waited for the door to open. But nothing happened. The figure had reached the office door on camera, but no one entered the room. I looked back at the monitor, and the hallway was empty. The figure had disappeared again, just like always. But this time, when I turned around, I saw something that made my blood freeze. On the security monitor showing the interior of the office, the camera that was supposed to be filming me, I could see 2 people. There was me standing by the desk, staring at the monitor, and there was the figure standing right behind me, close enough to touch. I spun around, but the office was empty. Just me, alone, surrounded by the quiet hum of electronic equipment. But on the monitor, clear as day, I could see both versions of myself sharing the same space. I reached out slowly toward where the figure appeared to be standing on camera. My hand passed through empty air, but on the monitor, I watched my hand pass directly through the figure's chest. That's when I understood what I was really seeing. The figure wasn't someone else who looked like me. It wasn't a prank or a technical glitch or a case of mistaken identity. It was me, from somewhere else. Another version of myself that existed in the same space but somehow displaced in time or reality. I was seeing myself from a parallel timeline, a version of me that worked the same just in the same building but experienced it slightly differently. Maybe in his reality he worked different hours, or the theater closed at different times. Or something about his schedule put him in these locations when they were empty in my timeline. I stayed late that night watching the monitors and trying to understand the pattern. The other me continued to appear periodically on different cameras throughout the building, always behaving like he belonged there, always unaware that he was being observed. And gradually I realized that if I could see him, he might be able to see me too. I started leaving notes in the places where I'd seen him appear most frequently. The next day, the notes were gone. For several weeks, we communicated through these notes, 2 versions of the same person trying to understand why we existed in the same space at different times. He told me that in his experience, he was working normal shifts, but occasionally seeing a figure on the security cameras who looked like him. We were both experiencing the same phenomenon from opposite sides. but our ability to communicate was limited and frustrating. Often, days would pass between messages, and sometimes my notes would disappear without being answered. It was like trying to have a conversation with someone through a time delay that neither of us could control or predict. Then one night in January, I received a note that changed everything. "I think I'm disappearing. The other staff members don't seem to see me anymore. Carol acts like I'm not here when I try to talk to her. I think I'm becoming like you, visible only on cameras, invisible to everyone else." I wrote back immediately, "What do you mean disappearing?" But I never got a response. The figure stopped appearing on the security cameras entirely. No more sightings in Theater 4, no more mysterious warm seats, no more notes left in our usual places. The other version of myself had simply vanished, leaving me alone with the knowledge that something in the Meridian cinema had the power to displace people from their own reality. I quit the job 2 weeks later. I couldn't handle the uncertainty of not knowing if I was next, if I would start disappearing too, becoming visible only to security cameras while the real world forgot I existed. But even now, 3 months later, I still think about that other version of myself. I wonder if he found a way back to his reality, or if he's trapped somewhere between timelines, watching other people live their lives while he exists only as a recording on security monitors. I also wonder if somewhere, in another timeline, another version of me is still working at the Meridian Cinema, watching security footage and trying to figure out why a figure that looks exactly like him keeps appearing in empty theaters. And sometimes, late at night, I catch myself checking the reflections in windows and mirrors a little too carefully, making sure that what I'm seeing matches what I expect to see. Because once you've seen proof that multiple versions of yourself can exist in the same space, you never quite trust that the version you're living is the only one that's real. Story 3, the patron who never left after closing. He didn't move. I asked again, nothing. When I walked closer, I realized he wasn't blinking. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead at the blank screen, but they never moved, never focused on anything specific. Just that empty, glassy stare that made my skin crawl. I ran to get my manager, but when we returned, the man was gone. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. He came back the next week and the week after that, each time appearing closer to the aisle like he was slowly making his way toward the exit, or toward me. I started working as an usher at the Palace Cinema right after I graduated high school. It was supposed to be temporary, just something to pay for gas and weekend plans while I figured out my next move. The Palace was one of those old single-screen theaters that somehow survived the multiplex invasion. Big Art Deco lobby, velvet curtains, balcony seating, the whole classic movie house experience. My job was straightforward: help customers find seats, clean up spills during intermissions, and do a final walkthrough after the last showing to make sure everyone had left the building. The manager, Mr. Garrett, was strict about that last part. He'd had problems in the past with people trying to sneak into multiple shows or hiding in the bathroom to avoid paying, so he required a thorough check of every row before we locked up for the night. The Palace usually ran 2 shows on weeknights, an early show at 7 p.m. and a late show at 9:30. By 11:45, everyone was supposed to be out, and I'd walk through the entire theater with my flashlight, checking each section systematically. Most nights, it was routine. Maybe I'd find a lost phone or wallet, occasionally some teenager's sweatshirt left behind, but usually just empty seats and scattered popcorn. It was on a Saturday night in early September when I first encountered the man who wouldn't leave. The late show had been a romantic drama, not exactly a blockbuster, so we'd only sold about 40 tickets. I'd watched most of the audience file out during the credits, chatting about the movie as they headed to the lobby. I gave them a few extra minutes to clear the building, then started my walkthrough. The palace had the main floor and a balcony level, so I always started upstairs and worked my way down. The balcony was empty as expected. I made my way down to the main floor and began checking the rows from back to front, sweeping my flashlight beam across each section. That's when I saw him. An older man, maybe in his 60s, sitting alone in the center section about halfway down. He was just sitting there, upright in his seat, facing the screen like the movie was still playing. But the credits had finished rolling 10 minutes ago, and the screen was dark except for the small maintenance light the projectionist left on. "Excuse me, sir," I called out from the back of the theater. "We're closing now." No response. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge that I'd spoken, didn't move at all. I walked down the aisle toward him, assuming he was elderly and maybe hadn't heard me clearly. "Sir, the movie's over." Still nothing. As I got closer, I could see he was well dressed. Dark suit, white shirt, thin tie. His hair was neatly combed and his posture was perfectly straight, like he was paying attention to something important. But there was something off about how still he was. When I reached his row, I stopped and really looked at him. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead at the blank screen, but they had a strange, glassy quality. He wasn't blinking. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds watching, and his eyes never moved or closed. I asked, starting to feel genuinely worried. Maybe he'd had some kind of medical emergency, a stroke or heart attack or something. I reached out to tap his shoulder, but something made me hesitate. There was something deeply unsettling about his stillness, the way he seemed frozen in place like a mannequin. Instead, I decided to get Mr. Garrett. I ran to the lobby and found Mr. Garrett counting the night's receipts in the office. "There's a customer in the theater who won't respond," I told him. Mr. Garrett sighed and put down his paperwork. Probably fell asleep. He grabbed his keys and followed me back into the theater. But when we got to the section where I'd seen the man, the seat was empty. Mr. Garrett asked, shining his own flashlight around the area. "Right here," I said, pointing to the exact seat. We searched the entire theater again, checking every row, the bathrooms, even the lobby and the area behind the concession stand. The building was completely empty except for us. "Maybe he left while you were getting me," Mr. Garrett suggested, but I could tell he was puzzled too. It had only taken me 2 minutes to reach the office and bring him back, and we would have seen anyone leaving through the lobby. "Must have," I agreed, though it didn't feel right. The next week passed normally. I did my regular walkthroughs without incident, and I started to convince myself that the strange encounter had been nothing more than an elderly customer who'd simply left while I wasn't looking. But the following Saturday night, it happened again. Same situation, late show, small audience, most people filed out after the credits. I started my walkthrough and there he was. Same man, same dark suit, same seat in the center section. Same perfectly still posture, staring at the blank screen with those glassy, unblinking eyes. This time I didn't bother trying to talk to him. I went straight to get Mr. Garrett. "He's back," I told him. Mr. Garrett looked skeptical, but he followed me into the theater. Once again, by the time we got there, the man was gone. Mr. Garrett asked, "I was sure, but how could I prove it? The man appeared and disappeared without leaving any trace, without being seen by anyone else." It sounded crazy even to me. Over the next month, the sightings became regular. Every Saturday night after the late show, I'd find the man sitting in that same seat, always perfectly still, always staring at the dark screen, always gone by the time I returned with help. But I started to notice something disturbing about his location. The first time I'd seen him, he was sitting in row M, seat 15, right in the center of the theater. The second time, he was in row M, seat 13, 2 seats closer to the aisle. The third time, row M, seat 11. He was moving, Each week he appeared 2 seats closer to the side aisle, like he was slowly making his way toward the exit, or toward where I always stood when I first spotted him. I started documenting the sightings, keeping a notebook where I recorded the exact seat number and any other details I noticed. The pattern was consistent. Every Saturday, 2 seats closer to the aisle, always the same posture and expression. By October, he'd moved from the center section to row M, seat 5, just 4 seats from the aisle. I started to dread Saturday night closings, wondering what would happen when he reached the end of the row. Would he disappear entirely, or would he start moving up the aisle toward the back of the theater? I tried to research the theater's history, looking for any information about patrons who died in the building or strange occurrences that might explain what I was seeing. The palace had been operating since 1923, and like any old building, it had its share of stories. A few heart attacks over the years, one person who'd fallen down the balcony stairs in the 1960s, but nothing that seemed directly connected to my mysterious patron. The Saturday night in late October, when the man reached row M, seat 3, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of leaving to get Mr. Garrett, I stayed in the theater and watched. I positioned myself in the back row and observed the man for over 20 minutes. He never moved, never blinked, never showed any sign of life except for the fact that he was somehow maintaining an upright sitting position. His breathing was so subtle that I couldn't be sure he was breathing at all. Then at exactly midnight, something changed. The man's head turned slowly to look directly at me. His eyes, which had been staring blankly at the screen, focused on my face with an intensity that made me feel like ice water was running through my veins. His expression didn't change. No emotion, no recognition, just that cold, glassy stare, but now it was directed at me. Personally. We looked at each other for maybe 10 seconds, though it felt much longer. Then gradually he turned his head back toward the screen and resumed his original position. I sat in the back row, paralyzed by fear and confusion, until I heard Mr. Garrett calling my name from the lobby. When I looked back at row M, the man was gone. That night, I told Mr. Garrett I was feeling sick and left early. I drove home in a daze, trying to process what had just happened. The man wasn't just some residual image or trick of the light. He was aware of me, conscious of my presence, and apparently capable of interaction. The following Saturday, I seriously considered calling in sick, but I needed the job and I couldn't avoid the palace forever based on what might have been hallucinations or an overactive imagination. When I arrived for my shift, Mr. Garrett pulled me aside. "Tyler, I want you to know that if you're having any personal problems, stress, family issues, anything, you can talk to me." I appreciated his concern, but how could I explain that I was being stalked by a ghost who moved 2 seats closer to me every week? That night's late show was a horror film, which felt grimly appropriate. As I watched the audience jump and scream at the movie's scares, I couldn't help thinking that none of them would believe the real horror that happened in this theater every Saturday after closing. When it came time for my walkthrough, I found the man in row M, seat 1, the aisle seat. He'd reached the end of the row. I stood at the back of the theater, shining my flashlight on him, wondering what would happen next week. Would he start moving up the aisle? Would he disappear now that he'd completed whatever journey he was on? As I watched, the man slowly stood up. He rose from his seat with deliberate mechanical movements, like someone learning to walk again after a long illness. Once upright, he turned to face the aisle, and by extension, turned to face me. Even from the back of the theater, I could see his eyes clearly in my flashlight beam. They weren't the eyes of a living person. They were cloudy, unfocused, like looking into murky water. The man began walking up the aisle toward me. His gait was slow and unsteady, but purposeful. Each step brought him closer, and with each step I could see more details that convinced me this wasn't a normal person. His skin had a waxy, artificial quality. His clothes, which had looked neat from a distance, were actually shabby and old-fashioned, like they hadn't been updated in decades. When he was about halfway up the aisle, I broke. I ran out of the theater, through the lobby, and straight to my car. I didn't stop to tell Mr. Garrett what had happened, didn't lock up properly, didn't follow any of the closing procedures I was supposed to complete. I just ran. I called in sick for the next 2 weeks, claiming I had the flu. Mr. Garrett was understanding and told me to take all the time I needed to recover. But I knew I couldn't avoid the palace forever. When I finally returned to work, it was on a Wednesday night. I was hoping that whatever was happening was specific to Saturday evenings, and that I could ease back into the job without encountering my mysterious patron. The Wednesday and Thursday shifts passed normally. Friday was quiet. But when Saturday rolled around again, I found myself filled with dread as closing time approached. The late show ended, the audience filed out, and I began my walkthrough with shaking hands and a flashlight that felt inadequate for whatever I might encounter. The theater was empty. Every row, every seat completely vacant. I searched thoroughly, checking behind seats and in the shadows, but found nothing unusual. I was relieved and disappointed at the same time. Maybe the man was gone. Whatever he'd been trying to accomplish completed when he'd reached the aisle. Maybe I'd finally be able to do my job without fear. But as I was finishing my check of the front rows, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the back of the theater. I turned around and shined my flashlight toward the rear of the auditorium. The man was there, standing in the back row where I usually position myself during my walkthroughs. He was facing forward, looking down the aisle at me, perfectly still except for the sound of his breathing, which was now audible throughout the quiet theater. He'd moved from the front to the back, from his seat to my position. Whatever game he was playing, whatever purpose he served, he was now occupying the space I thought of as mine. I realized that the man wasn't trying to leave the theater. He was trying to replace me. I quit that night, leaving my uniform and keys on Mr. Garrett's desk, with a note explaining that I'd found other opportunities. I didn't mention the real reason for my departure, knowing it would sound insane. Mr. Garrett called me a few days later to ask if I was sure about leaving, saying he'd been happy with my work and would be willing to discuss a raise or schedule changes if that would convince me to stay. It's not about the money, I told him. 3 weeks later, I heard from a friend who still worked at the palace that they'd hired a new usher, a guy named Marcus who was about my age and height. My friend mentioned that Marcus seemed nervous about the Saturday night shifts and had asked several times about the theater's history. I wanted to warn Marcus about what he might encounter, but how could I? Even if he believed me, what could he do? The man in the dark suit seemed to be a permanent fixture of the palace cinema, appearing every Saturday night, moving through the theater according to some pattern only he understood. I drive past the palace sometimes, usually on Saturday nights, and I always slow down to look at the marquee and the Art Deco facade. The building looks normal and welcoming, exactly like the kind of place where you'd take a date to see a classic film or enjoy a quiet evening out. But I know that after the last show ends and the audience goes home, something else begins. A different kind of performance, one with an audience of one and a star who never takes a bow. I wonder if Marcus has seen him yet. I wonder if the man is still following the same pattern, moving 2 seats closer each week until he reaches some predetermined destination. And I wonder what happens to the ushers who encounter him when he completes whatever journey he's been taking for who knows how many years. Sometimes I think about applying for a job at one of the multiplex theaters across town. Someplace modern and brightly lit where the only mysteries are which movies will be popular and whether the popcorn machine will break down during the busy weekend shifts. But even in those sterile corporate theaters, I find myself checking the back rows more carefully than I probably should. Because once you've seen proof that some patrons never really leave after the show ends, you start to wonder what other theaters might have their own permanent guests, sitting patiently in the dark, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Story 4. Something lived in Theater 9. I found a hole behind the screen, large enough for a person, and drag marks leading into the wall. The concrete around the opening was stained with something dark and sticky, and the smell that had been plaguing Theater 9 for months was much stronger here, almost overwhelming. I heard breathing from inside the wall, slow and labored, like someone struggling with each breath. When I shined my flashlight into the opening, I saw eyes staring back at me from the darkness, and a voice whispered my name in a tone that didn't sound entirely human. Working at the Sunset Megaplex was supposed to be easy money. 20 screens, steady crowds, decent management that didn't micromanage as long as you did your job. I was hired as part of the cleaning crew, working the overnight shift to reset the theaters between the last show and the next day's first matinee. The work was routine: empty trash, vacuum floors, wipe down seats, check for lost items. Each theater took about 30 minutes to clean properly, and with a crew of 4 people, we could handle the entire complex in about 6 hours. Not exciting work, but it paid well for an overnight shift, and I liked the solitude. Theater 9 was always the problem theater. It was one of the mid-sized auditoriums, about 200 seats, usually showing second-run releases or smaller independent films. But from my first week on the job, Theater 9 gave me trouble. It was always the coldest room in the building, even though maintenance insisted the HVAC system was working properly. Customers complained constantly about the smell, a musty organic odor like wet leaves mixed with something rotting. Management blamed old ventilation issues and promised to address the problem, but months passed without improvement. If anything, the smell got worse over time and the temperature seemed to drop a few more degrees. But those weren't the only problems with Theater 9. I'd find popcorn scattered across seats that no one had occupied during the previous showing. Drinks knocked over in empty rows, leaving sticky puddles on the floor. Sometimes entire sections would be disturbed, seat cushions askew, cup holders filled with debris that hadn't been there during my previous cleaning. At first, I assumed teenagers were sneaking between showings and making a mess. But Theater 9 showed mostly art films and documentaries, not exactly the kind of movies that attracted rowdy kids. And the mess always appeared in different sections, never following the pattern you'd expect from people trying to hide from ushers. The strangest part was what showed up on the security footage. Our supervisor, Janet, reviewed the overnight cameras every morning to make sure we were doing our jobs properly. She started asking me about Theater 9 after my 3rd week, showing me video clips that didn't make sense. "Look at this," she said, pointing to her computer screen. The footage showed several rows of seats in disarray, exactly like what I'd been finding during my shifts. But the timestamp proved the mess appeared after I'd already cleaned the theater and moved on to other rooms, Janet asked. I was sure. I had a systematic routine and never skipped steps, but the video evidence suggested otherwise. "Maybe the ventilation system is blowing things around," I suggested. Janet looked skeptical but didn't push the issue. Over the next few weeks, though, she started checking Theater 9 more frequently, both during and after my cleaning shifts. That's when we discovered something that changed everything. Janet was reviewing footage from a particularly busy Saturday night when she noticed movement in Theater 9 during a time when the room was supposed to be empty. Not the scattered debris we'd been seeing. but actual motion across the frame. "Come look at this," she called to me during my next shift. On her monitor, I watched grainy security footage of Theater 9's interior. The timestamp showed 3:15 a.m., well after the last show and during the time when I would have been cleaning other theaters. The image was dark and unclear, but something was definitely moving along the back wall where no doors or aisles existed. It looked like a shadow, but shadows don't move independently of light sources. This darkness seemed to flow across the wall like liquid, changing shape and density as it traveled from one side of the screen to the other. I suggested, though I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. "That's what I thought," Janet said. The shadow shape moved toward the front of the theater near the screen area. As it traveled, seats throughout the auditorium began to move, not all at once, but in a wave pattern, like something invisible was walking through the rows and disturbing everything in its path. The footage lasted about 3 minutes. Then everything went still. When I cleaned Theater 9 the next morning, I found the same scattered mess I'd been dealing with for weeks. But now I knew it wasn't caused by teenage pranksters or ventilation problems. Something was living in Theater 9, and it was active during the hours when the theater was supposed to be empty. Janet and I started documenting everything more carefully. We installed additional cameras with better night vision capabilities and began reviewing footage from Theater 9 every morning. The activity wasn't constant, but it occurred several times per week, always during the early morning hours when the building was closed to the public. The patterns became clearer over time. The shadow entity seemed to emerge from the area behind the movie screen and travel throughout the theater, disturbing seats and leaving debris in its wake. Sometimes it appeared to interact with specific sections more intensively, concentrating its activity in particular rows or areas. But the most disturbing development was that the entity seemed to be getting bolder. Instead of limiting its movement to the walls and back areas of the theater, it began venturing into the main seating areas during times when customers were present. We started getting complaints from patrons about feeling watched, about cold spots that moved around the theater, about sounds that didn't match what was happening on screen. One customer reported that something had grabbed his ankle during a quiet, dramatic scene. Another said she felt breathing on her neck in an otherwise empty row. A couple left in the middle of a film, claiming that someone was whispering their names from seats they could see were vacant. Management initially dismissed these complaints as typical customer nonsense, but they became too frequent to ignore. Janet started reviewing daytime footage from Theater 9 and found evidence of the same shadow entity activity during regular business hours. That's when she asked me to do something that terrified me. She wanted me to spend an entire night in Theater 9 observing and documenting whatever was happening firsthand. "The cameras aren't giving us enough detail," she explained. I agreed reluctantly, motivated partly by curiosity and partly by the overtime pay she offered. We set up the observation for a Tuesday night when Theater 9 wasn't showing any films, so I could work undisturbed. I arrived at the theater around midnight with a camping chair, several flashlights, a digital camera, and a thermos of coffee. Janet locked me inside Theater 9 and said she'd check on me every hour via radio. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. I sat in the back row, scanning the theater with my flashlight and taking notes about temperature changes and any unusual sounds. The room was definitely colder than the other theaters, and there was a subtle but persistent noise like air moving through spaces where no vents existed. Around 2:30 a.m., the activity began. I heard scratching sounds coming from the area behind the movie screen, like something with claws was trying to dig through concrete or metal. The scratching continued for several minutes, growing louder and more intense until I decided to investigate. The area behind the screen was accessible through a maintenance door on the side wall. I'd been back there before during regular cleaning, and it was usually just an empty space with some electrical equipment and storage for screen maintenance tools. But when I opened the door that night, I found something that shouldn't have been there. There was a hole in the back wall, roughly circular, about 3 feet in diameter. The concrete around the opening looked like it had been carved or worn away over a long period of time, leaving rough edges and deep gouges. The hole led into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. The smell that had been plaguing Theater 9 was much stronger here, emanating from whatever lay beyond the hole. It was organic and foul, like decay mixed with something alive and sweating. As I approached the opening, I could hear sounds coming from inside. Breathing sounds, slow and labored, like someone struggling with each breath. And beneath that, a subtle scratching noise like fingernails on concrete. I shined my flashlight into the hole, trying to see how deep it went or what might be living inside. The beam disappeared into darkness without illuminating anything useful, but I could hear the breathing sounds getting closer, as if whatever was in there was moving toward the light. That's when I saw the eyes. 2 pale, reflective points staring back at me from the darkness, maybe 6 feet inside the hole. They didn't look human. Too large, too widely spaced, too bright in the flashlight beam. But they were definitely looking at me with intelligence and awareness. I called softly, though I immediately regretted making any sound. The voice was wrong in every way, too breathy, too soft, like someone trying to speak while choking. It knew my name, but I had no idea how or why. I backed away from the hole and radioed Janet immediately. "I found something behind the screen," she asked. I looked back toward the hole and saw that the eyes had moved closer to the opening. Whatever was in there was definitely coming toward me. "Something's living in the walls," I said. "It knows my name." Janet arrived with 2 security guards within 10 minutes, but by the time they got to Theater 9, the hole was empty. We could still hear breathing sounds from deep inside, but the eyes were gone and the voice didn't respond when we called out. The security guards treated the situation like a standard trespasser problem, assuming someone had broken into the building and was hiding in the walls. But when they used flashlights and mirrors to examine the hole more thoroughly, they found something that changed their assessment. The hole didn't just go back 3 or 4 feet and stop. It connected to a network of spaces between the walls, probably created over years or decades by whatever was living inside them. We could see scratched messages in the concrete, though none of us could read what they said. And scattered throughout the accessible areas were personal items that customers had reported missing over the years. Wallets, jewelry, car keys, cell phones, dozens of objects that had apparently been collected and brought into these hidden spaces. "This thing has been stealing from customers," one of the security guards said. But I knew it was more than theft. The entity in Theater 9 had been studying us, learning about us, taking pieces of our lives back to its lair behind the walls. It knew my name because it had been watching me work night after night, becoming familiar with my routines and habits. Management closed Theater 9 the next day and brought in contractors to seal the hole and search for other openings. They found 3 more access points behind other theaters, all showing evidence of long-term habitation. The spaces between the walls contained more personal items, along with what looked like nesting areas made from collected fabric and paper. But they never found the entity itself. The contractors sealed all the holes with steel plates and concrete, and Theater 9 remained closed for 2 weeks while they worked. When it finally reopened, the temperature had returned to normal, and the smell was gone. For about a month, then customers started complaining again. Not about the same issues, no more cold spots or organic smells, but about different problems. Sounds coming from inside the walls during quiet scenes, scratching noises during dialogue, and occasionally whispered names that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I quit my job at the Sunset Megaplex 3 weeks after Theater 9 reopened. I couldn't handle the knowledge that something intelligent and hostile was living in the building, possibly trapped now, but certainly not eliminated. Janet told me that they'd hired a new cleaning crew and that the overnight shifts were continuing normally. But she also mentioned that the new workers had been asking questions about Theater 9, reporting strange sounds and unusual messes that appeared after cleaning. I've heard from friends who still go to movies at the Sunset that Theater 9 is now used primarily for storage, not regular screenings. They claim it's due to ongoing maintenance issues, but I suspect management knows more than they're admitting about what lives behind those walls. Sometimes I drive past the theater complex at night and wonder if the entity is still there, still collecting personal items from unsuspecting customers, still learning about the people who visit its territory. The hole I found might be sealed, but creatures that can carve through concrete walls probably aren't stopped permanently by steel plates. I also wonder about other movie theaters, other old buildings with spaces between the walls where something patient and intelligent could make a home. Once you've seen evidence that we're not alone in these places we think we understand, you start to question whether any large old building is really as empty as it appears to be. The worst part is knowing that somewhere in the walls of the Sunset Megaplex there's probably a collection of personal items that include something of mine. A pen I lost, a receipt that fell out of my pocket, some small piece of evidence that I was there and that something was watching me closely enough to know my name and my routine. And if it collected something of mine, it probably collected something from everyone who worked there long enough for it to become familiar with their patterns. Which means it's still learning about us, still gathering information, still preparing for whatever purpose drives something to live in darkness between our walls and steal pieces of our lives. Story 5. The movie that wasn't on the schedule. I checked the booth. No one had loaded a reel. The projector was running by itself, showing footage that looked old and wrong, grainy, silent, deeply unsettling. The title card was in a language I didn't recognize, but the images were clear enough. It was showing people in what looked like our theater, but from a different time period, maybe the 1940s or 50s. And in the back row, barely visible in the shadowy footage, was someone who looked exactly like me, watching the screen with the same confused expression I was wearing right now. I was the closing projectionist at the Roxy Theater, a small independent cinema that specialized in art house films and classic movie revivals. It was the kind of place where film buffs came to see restored prints of Hitchcock movies or foreign films that never got wide releases. My job was to run the final showing of each night and make sure all the equipment was properly shut down before locking up. The Roxy was old school in the best way. We still used 35mm film projectors for most of our screenings, and I'd learned to operate the equipment from Eddie, a guy who'd been running projectors since the 1980s. There's something satisfying about threading film through mechanical equipment, timing the reel changes perfectly, maintaining the rhythm that keeps a movie flowing smoothly for the audience. Most nights I worked alone during the late show. Eddie handled the earlier screenings, and I'd come in around 8 p.m. to take over for the final show that usually started at 9:30. Simple routine: run the film, shut down the equipment, lock up the booth, and head home by midnight. It was a Wednesday night in November when I first noticed the problem with Theater 2. We had 3 small screening rooms at the Roxy, and Theater 2 was showing a restored print of The Third Man for its 9:30 showing. About 40 people in attendance, which was good for a weeknight. I'd started the film without any issues, and everything ran smoothly through the first reel. Through the booth window, I could see light flickering from a projector that should have been idle. Theater 2's 9:30 show was still running in the main booth, but somehow a second projector in the same room was operating independently. That was impossible. Each theater had only one projector, and I was the only person in the building with access to the booth equipment. I finished managing the reel change for The Third Man, then went to investigate Theater 2's booth more carefully. When I opened the booth door, I could see that projector No. 1 was running The Third Man as expected, but projector No. 2, which should have been cold and shut down, was running film through its mechanism. The strange part was that we didn't have a projector number 2 in Theater 2. Each booth had one primary projector and backup equipment, but the backup projector in Theater 2 hadn't been operational for years. Eddie had told me it was broken and waiting for parts that the theater couldn't afford to replace. I looked out the booth window at the screen and could see two overlapping images. The main projection showed Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten in post-war Vienna, exactly as it should. But there was a second, dimmer image superimposed over the official film. Something older looking, grainier in black and white that was somehow different from The Third Man's black and white photography. The audience didn't seem to notice. They were absorbed in the official movie, and the secondary image was subtle enough that it might have looked like a minor projection problem or shadows on the screen. I tried to shut down the backup projector, but I couldn't figure out how to turn it off. The power switches were in the off position, but the machine continued running. Even when I unplugged it from the wall, the projector kept operating, drawing power from some source I couldn't identify. The film it was showing wasn't anything I recognized. No title cards, no credits, just footage of what looked like people in a movie theater. The quality suggested it was much older than The Third Man, maybe from the 1940s or earlier. The people on screen were dressed in period clothing and appeared to be watching a movie, but I couldn't tell what they were seeing. I watched the mysterious footage for several minutes, trying to understand what I was looking at. The camera seemed to be positioned in the back of a theater, filming the audience rather than the screen. Occasionally, people would turn around and look directly into the camera, as if they were aware they were being recorded. And the theater they were sitting in looked exactly like Theater 2. Same Art Deco architecture, same seat configuration, same decorative elements around the screen. But the people were from a different era, and the overall atmosphere was somehow wrong. Too dark, too shadowy, like the theater was lit by different technology or existed in a different time period. Then I saw something that made me stop breathing. In the back row of the mysterious footage, barely visible in the grainy image, was someone who looked exactly like me. Same profile, same hair, same posture. The figure was wearing clothes I didn't recognize, a white shirt and dark vest that looked like 1940s fashion. But the face was unmistakably mine, and this other version of me was staring at the screen with the same confused expression I was wearing as I watched the footage. I was looking at a recording of myself in a theater from 70 years before I was born. The Third Man ended normally, and the audience filed out without commenting on any projection problems. I stayed in the booth, staring at the backup projector that continued running its mysterious film even though it was supposedly broken and unplugged. The footage seemed to be on a loop. I watched the same scenes repeat several times. The vintage theater audience, the occasional person turning to look at the camera, and my own face appearing periodically in the back row, always with that same expression of confused recognition. Around 11:30 p.m., I decided to go into Theater 2 and see what the mysterious projection looked like from the audience's perspective. The theater was dark except for the emergency lighting and the beam from the backup projector. The image quality was poor but detailed enough to confirm what I'd observed from the booth. It was definitely Theater 2, but from a different time. The seats looked newer, the carpet was a different pattern, and the walls had decorations that weren't there now. But the architecture was identical, down to the specific proportions and angles that made the Roxy's theaters distinctive. I sat in the back row, in the same position where I'd seen my apparent double on screen. As I settled into the seat, I looked up at the projection booth and saw something that made my hands shake. There was someone in the booth, a figure in period clothing, white shirt, dark vest, exactly like what my double had been wearing in the footage. He was operating projection equipment that looked older and different from the modern setup I'd been using. But the booth was supposed to be locked and I was the only person in the building. I ran back up to the projection booth, but when I got there it was empty. Just me, the modern equipment, and the backup projector that continued running its impossible film. No sign that anyone else had been there. I looked back out the booth window at Theater 2 and the mysterious footage was still playing. But now, in addition to the vintage audience, I could see myself sitting in the back row. Not my double from the 1940s, but me right now wearing my current clothes and looking as confused as I felt. The film was recording me in real time while simultaneously showing footage from decades ago. I left the Roxy immediately, not bothering to complete my closing routine. I locked the main entrance and drove home, trying to convince myself that I'd experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by stress or fatigue. But the next morning, Eddie called me with questions. He asked, "I came in early to check on something and the backup projector was running." "I noticed that too," I said carefully. "That's the weird part. It's not just running. It's got film loaded in it. Film I've never seen before." Eddie described the same vintage theater footage I'd seen, including the audience from a different era and the strange, loop-like quality of the content. I asked. "Nothing. The Roxy opened in 1947 and we've got some old promotional materials from the early years, but nothing like what's running on that projector." That afternoon, I went to the local library and researched the Roxy's history. The theater had indeed opened in 1947, initially as a single-screen venue that was later divided into the 3 smaller theaters we had now. I found some old photographs from the opening year showing well-dressed audiences attending premieres and special events. In one photograph, dated December 1947, I found my answer. The image showed the original theater during a special screening, with the audience seated and facing the camera instead of the screen. In the back row, clearly visible despite the old photograph's graininess, was someone who looked exactly like me. Not similar, identical. Same face, same hair, same posture, wearing the white shirt and dark vest I'd seen in the mysterious footage. According to the caption, the photograph was taken during the theater's inaugural month, at a screening attended by local dignitaries and film industry figures. But I was born in 1992, 45 years after the photograph was taken. I brought the photograph to Eddie and showed him what I'd found. He studied it carefully, comparing it to my face, and his expression grew increasingly troubled. "This is impossible," he said, "but the resemblance is perfect." That night I returned to work with a mixture of curiosity and dread. I wanted to understand what was happening with the backup projector, but I was afraid of what I might discover. Theater 2 was scheduled to show a Bergman retrospective film for the 9:30 show. I set up the main projector normally, but I also prepared to observe the backup projector more systematically. The mysterious footage began again around 10 p.m., shortly after the official screening started. This time, I was ready with a camera and notepad to document what I saw. The vintage footage was more detailed than I'd initially realized. It wasn't just random scenes of people in a theater. It was a complete recording of specific screenings from the Roxy's early years. I could see audience reactions to particular films, people leaving during intermissions, even brief conversations between patrons. And in every sequence, my double appeared in the same back row seat, always wearing the same clothes, always with the same expression of confused recognition. But as I watched more carefully, I realized the footage wasn't just from 1947. The clothing styles changed slightly between sequences, and I could see different films reflected in people's eyes as they watched the screen. The mysterious projection was showing screenings from multiple years in the late 1940s and early 1950s. My double appeared in all of them, never aging, never changing clothes, always looking like he was trying to figure out why he was there. Around 11 p.m., something new happened. Instead of showing the vintage footage, the backup projector began displaying what was happening in Theater 2 right now. I could see the current audience watching the Bergman film, and in the projection booth, I could see myself operating the equipment. But the image wasn't coming from any camera I could identify. The angle was wrong for the security cameras, and the perspective seemed to shift and move as if it were being filmed by someone walking around the theater. Then I saw something that made me understand the full scope of what was happening. In the current footage being projected by the backup projector, I could see someone sitting in the back row of Theater 2. Someone wearing a white shirt and dark vest, looking exactly like the figure from the 1947 photographs. My double from the past was attending the current screening. I left the projection booth and went into Theater 2 to confirm what I'd seen. The current audience was absorbed in the Bergman film, but in the back row, in the same seat I'd seen in all the vintage footage, someone was sitting alone. He looked exactly like me, down to details. I could see clearly now that I was in the same room, same facial features, same hair, same confused expression. But he was wearing clothes from 70 years ago, and he seemed to exist independently of the current time period. When I approached his row, he turned to look at me. We stared at each other for several seconds, two versions of the same person separated by decades, but somehow occupying the same space. He didn't seem surprised to see me, just sad and resigned, like he'd been waiting for this encounter for a long time. I whispered. He didn't answer, but he gestured toward the screen where the Bergman film was playing. Then he pointed to himself, and I understood what he was trying to communicate. He'd been watching movies at the Roxy since 1947, attending every screening, trapped in some kind of temporal loop that kept him anchored to the theater while time moved forward around him. And somehow, the backup projector was recording both timelines simultaneously, showing his vintage experiences and my current ones as if they were happening in parallel. The Bergman film ended, and the audience began to leave. My double remained in his seat until the theater was empty. Then he stood up and walked toward the exit, but instead of leaving through the lobby, he faded away like he was made of smoke or shadows. I never saw him again, but the backup projector continued running vintage footage for several more weeks. Eddie eventually had it removed by technicians who said they couldn't understand how it had been operating without power or proper film stock. I kept working at the Roxy for another 2 months, but I never felt comfortable in Theater 2 after that night. I'd find myself checking the back row during screenings, looking for the figure in period clothing who somehow shared my face and my confusion about why he was there. When I finally quit, I told Eddie it was for a better opportunity across town, but really I couldn't handle the knowledge that somewhere in the Roxy's history, a version of myself was trapped in an endless loop of movie screenings, watching films from an era I'd never lived through while a mysterious projector recorded everything for reasons I'd never understand. I still go to movies occasionally, but always at modern multiplex theaters where the equipment is digital and the architecture is too new to have accumulated decades of unexplained recordings. Because once you've seen evidence that some theaters can capture and replay events from multiple time periods simultaneously, you start to wonder what other impossible footage might be running on projectors that shouldn't be operational, in booths that shouldn't be accessible for audiences that include people who shouldn't exist. Story 6. I was locked in after the last show. I tried every door. Locked. Then I heard footsteps in the lobby, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth in front of the ticket counter. I hid in the bathroom for an hour, listening to the footsteps get closer, hearing them stop right outside the bathroom door. When I finally got the courage to look, I saw wet footprints leading from the front doors to the bathroom stall next to mine. I never heard anyone come in. The footprints were fresh, still dripping, but it wasn't raining outside. Working at the Vista Theater was supposed to be temporary, just a part-time job while I finished community college. I handled concessions during the evening shows and stayed late on Wednesdays to do inventory, counting candy, restocking soda syrup, organizing the storage room behind the concession stand. The Vista was a small operation, just 2 screens in an older part of town. Family-owned by people who actually cared about movies. The kind of place where they'd hold special screenings of classics and knew most of their regular customers by name. I liked the atmosphere and the flexible schedule that worked around my classes. Inventory nights were usually quiet and straightforward. The last show ended around 10:30 and I'd spend an hour or two in the storage room with clipboards and calculators, making sure our supply levels matched what the book said we should have. Simple work that I could do alone while listening to music. The storage room was behind the concession counter, accessible through a door that most customers never noticed. It was larger than you'd expect, running almost the full width of the building, with shelves of candy boxes, cases of soda, and the machinery that kept the popcorn and nacho cheese dispensers operational. On the Wednesday night when everything went wrong, I was running late with inventory because we'd had an unexpectedly busy evening. The last customers didn't leave until almost 11 p.m., and I didn't get started on the storage room until nearly 11:30. I was deep into counting boxes of junior mints when I heard the front doors of the theater open and close, not unusual. The manager, Mr. Rodriguez, sometimes came back in the evenings to check on things or handle paperwork. I assumed he'd seen my car in the parking lot and wanted to make sure everything was okay. But he didn't call out to let me know he was there, and I didn't hear any footsteps or movement in the lobby. After a few minutes, I decided to go say hello and let him know I'd be finished with inventory in about an hour. When I came out of the storage room, the lobby was dark and empty. That was strange. I'd definitely heard the doors and there were no other exits Mr. Rodriguez would have used. I walked over to the front entrance and tried the doors, thinking maybe he'd just stepped outside for a phone call or to check something in the parking lot. The doors were locked, not just closed, but locked with the heavy deadbolt that could only be engaged from inside the building. And when I looked out through the glass, I could see that my car was the only vehicle in the parking lot. I checked my phone. 11:47 p.m. No missed calls, no messages from Mr. Rodriguez or anyone else. I went back to the storage room and tried to focus on finishing the inventory, assuming I'd misheard something or that the doors had been caused by wind or the building settling. Old buildings made all kinds of noises, especially at night when the temperature dropped and the structure contracted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was in the building with me. Around 12:15 a.m., I heard footsteps in the lobby. Not the random creaking sounds you'd expect from an empty building, but deliberate, rhythmic footsteps like someone walking back and forth across the carpeted area in front of the concession stand. Slow, measured steps that suggested someone pacing while thinking or waiting for something. I stopped what I was doing and listened carefully. The footsteps continued for several minutes, following what sounded like a regular pattern. Across the lobby, pause, back across the lobby, pause, repeat. I called out, "Mr. Rodriguez?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Complete silence for about 30 seconds, then they resumed, but now They seemed to be moving in different directions around the lobby. I grabbed a flashlight from the storage room emergency kit and went to investigate. The lobby was still dark and appeared empty, but I could hear the footsteps clearly now, echoing off the walls and ceiling in a way that confirmed someone was definitely walking around the space. The problem was that I couldn't see anyone. I shined my flashlight across the entire lobby, checking behind the concession counter, near the theater entrances, around the promotional displays and ticket booth. Empty. But the footsteps continued, and they seemed to be following my flashlight beam, staying just out of sight while maintaining a steady rhythm. I tried the front doors again. Still locked. I tried the emergency exits that led directly from each theater to the outside parking lot. Also locked, and not with the standard push-bar emergency locks. These were secured with deadbolts that shouldn't have been engaged during business hours. That's when I realized I was truly trapped inside the building with whatever was making those footsteps. I returned to the storage room and tried to think rationally about the situation. Maybe there was a malfunction with the automated locking system, and the doors had engaged prematurely. Maybe the footsteps were caused by the building's heating system or some kind of mechanical issue I wasn't familiar with. But even as I tried to rationalize what was happening, I could hear the pacing continue in the lobby. Back and forth, like someone waiting for something important to happen. I decided to call Mr. Rodriguez and explain the situation. His number was posted on the office bulletin board, and this seemed like exactly the kind of emergency that warranted waking up the manager. But my phone had no signal. Full bars earlier in the evening, but now nothing. I tried texting, calling, even attempting to connect to the internet, but nothing worked. It was like the building had become a dead zone for all electronic communication. Around 1 a.m., the footsteps changed pattern. Instead of pacing back and forth across the lobby, they began moving in what sounded like a circle around the perimeter of the space. Steady, deliberate steps that traced the same route repeatedly. From the front doors, along the wall, past the concession stand, around the theater entrances, back to the front doors, and with each circuit, the footsteps seemed to be getting closer to the storage room door. I turned off my flashlight and listened in the dark, trying to track the movement and determine exactly where the invisible walker was at any given moment. The sound was clear and consistent, like dress shoes on carpet, and I could hear subtle variations that suggested the person was adjusting their path slightly with each loop. After about 20 minutes of circular pacing, the footsteps stopped directly outside the storage room door. I held my breath and waited, staring at the door handle and wondering if it would start to turn. But nothing happened. Just silence, and the feeling that someone was standing inches away from me, with only a thin door between us. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl. Breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing, like someone trying to catch their breath after physical exertion. It was coming from just outside the storage room, and it was loud enough that I could hear the rhythm clearly. In, out, with pauses between breaths that lasted longer than seemed humanly possible. I stayed perfectly still, afraid that any movement or sound would draw attention to my exact location. The breathing continued for several minutes, and I could swear I heard it getting closer to the door, as if whoever was out there was leaning against it or pressing their face close to the gap at the bottom. Around 1:30 a.m., the breathing stopped and the footsteps resumed. But now they were different. Instead of the steady, measured pacing I'd been hearing, the steps were irregular and seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Like several people were walking around the lobby at the same time, but not in coordination with each other. I could hear overlapping footsteps, different rhythms, different weights and gaits. Some sounded like the dress shoes I'd been hearing all night, but others sounded like boots or sneakers or even bare feet on carpet, and they were all moving toward the storage room. I realized I needed to find another way out of the building, Staying hidden wasn't a long-term solution, and the invisible crowd in the lobby seemed to be getting more active and focused on my location. The storage room had a small window near the ceiling, originally installed for ventilation but large enough that I might be able to squeeze through it if I could reach it. I stacked boxes and climbed up to check whether the window was accessible. The window was painted shut and hadn't been opened in years, but I managed to scrape away enough paint to get it moving. When I finally got it open and looked outside, I could see the parking lot and my car about 50 feet away. But I also saw something that made me freeze. There were people in the parking lot, multiple figures standing motionless between the cars, all facing the theater building. They were too far away and too shadowed for me to see clearly, but they appeared to be waiting for something. As I watched, one of the figures turned and looked directly at the storage room window. Even at that distance, I could feel the intensity of their attention, like they'd been aware of me the entire time and were just waiting to see what I would do next. I closed the window immediately and climbed down from the boxes. Whatever was happening, it involved both the inside and outside of the building, and I was apparently trapped in the middle of it. The footsteps in the lobby had grown louder and more chaotic. It sounded like dozens of people walking around out there, some pacing, some circling, some just standing and shifting their weight from foot to foot. But no voices, no conversation, just movement and the occasional sound of breathing. I decided my best option was to wait until dawn and hope that whatever was happening would end when morning came. I found a corner of the storage room behind some large boxes where I could hide and still keep an eye on the door. Around 3 a.m., something new happened. I heard the front doors open and close, followed by the unmistakable sound of wet footsteps squelching across the lobby carpet. Not the dry footsteps I'd been hearing all night, but the sound of someone walking in soaking wet shoes, leaving puddles with every step. The wet footsteps moved slowly across the lobby, and I could hear water dripping steadily like rain running off clothing or hair. But it wasn't raining outside. I'd checked through the window multiple times and the weather was clear. The wet footsteps approached the storage room door and stopped. I heard water dripping right outside, steady drops hitting the carpet like a leaky faucet. Then I heard the door handle turn. I pressed myself deeper into the corner behind the boxes and watched as the storage room door opened slowly. Water began seeping under the door, spreading across the concrete floor in a dark puddle that reflected the dim light from my flashlight. But I couldn't see anyone entering the room, just water dripping and flowing from an invisible source, and the sound of wet footsteps moving around the storage room like someone was searching for something. The wet footsteps moved methodically through the storage room, passing close enough to my hiding spot that I could feel water drops falling on my arms and smell the musty, organic odor of standing water and wet fabric. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped near the center of the room. The dripping continued, but the movement ceased, as if the invisible person was standing still and listening. Then I heard my name, whispered in a voice that sounded like someone speaking underwater, distorted and bubbling. I didn't respond, didn't move, barely breathed. But the voice came again, closer now, like the speaker was moving toward my corner. "Marcus, I know you're here." The wet footsteps resumed, heading directly toward my hiding spot. I could see the water trail leading across the floor, getting closer with each step, accompanied by the sound of dripping that grew louder as the invisible person approached. Just as the footsteps reached the boxes I was hiding behind, I heard something that saved me. The sound of morning birds chirping outside the window. Dawn was breaking, and immediately all the sounds in the storage room stopped. No more footsteps, no more dripping, no more voices calling my name. Just silence and the gradual light of sunrise filtering through the small window. I waited another hour before coming out of hiding, making sure the building was truly quiet before moving from my corner. The storage room was dry. No puddles, no water stains, no evidence that anything had been dripping throughout the night. When I tried the front doors, they opened normally. My phone had full signal again, and everything appeared to be functioning exactly as it should during regular business hours. I finished the inventory quickly and left a note for Mr. Rodriguez explaining that I'd stayed late to complete the work but hadn't encountered any problems. I didn't mention the locked doors, the footsteps, or the wet visitor who knew my name. When I returned to work the following week, Mr. Rodriguez asked if I'd noticed anything unusual during my Wednesday inventory session. I asked. The lobby carpet was soaking wet when I came in Thursday morning, like someone had been walking around in there with muddy boots or had spilled several gallons of water. I told him I hadn't noticed any water issues, which was technically true. I hadn't seen the water, just heard it and felt it dripping on me in the storage room. Must have been a pipe problem that resolved itself, he concluded. But I knew it wasn't a pipe problem. I never volunteered for Wednesday night inventory again, claiming that the late hours conflicted with my class schedule. Mr. Rodriguez was understanding and found other employees to handle the midweek responsibilities. I kept working at the Vista for another 3 months, but I never felt entirely comfortable in the building after that night. During evening shifts, I'd find myself listening more carefully to the sounds around me, checking to make sure the front doors remained accessible, and paying attention to whether my phone maintained a signal throughout the shift. I also started noticing things about the theater that I'd overlooked before. Old water stains on the lobby carpet that seemed to form patterns, as if the same areas got wet repeatedly. Customers occasionally mentioning that they felt like they were being watched during late shows, or that they'd heard footsteps in the lobby during quiet scenes. And sometimes during closing procedures, I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Figures standing just outside the range of the lobby lighting, always still and patient, like they were waiting for the right moment to come inside. When I finally quit the job to transfer to a 4-year university, I made sure to finish my last shift well before closing time. I didn't want to risk being alone in the Vista after hours again, trapped with whatever patient entities spent their nights pacing the lobby and searching for employees who stayed too late. I still drive past the theater occasionally, usually during daytime hours when it looks normal and welcoming. But I've noticed that the now hiring sign in the front window seems to be a permanent fixture, suggesting that they have trouble keeping employees long term. And I wonder if other people have had experiences similar to mine. Wednesday night inventory sessions that lasted longer than expected, locked doors that shouldn't have been locked, and the sound of wet footsteps searching through empty buildings for employees whose names they somehow learned. Because once you've spent a night trapped in a theater with invisible visitors who know who you are and where you're hiding, you realize that some places aren't truly empty even when they appear to be, and some night shifts come with responsibilities that no employee manual ever mentions. Story 7. The couple in row G. They turned and looked directly at me. Not a casual glance, but a deliberate, sustained stare that lasted several seconds. Even from the back of the theater, I could see their faces clearly, pale, expressionless, with eyes that reflected the screen's light in an unnatural way. The woman smiled at me, but it was wrong somehow, too wide, like she was trying to remember how smiling worked. Then they both turned back to face the screen in perfect unison, and I realized they'd been waiting for me to see them. They wanted me to know they were aware of me. Working at the Grandview Theater meant dealing with all kinds of customers, families, teenagers, elderly couples, first dates, people who talked during movies, people who brought outside food despite our policies. After 2 years as head usher, I thought I'd seen every type of moviegoer and learned to handle any situation that might arise during a shift. The Grandview was a mid-sized theater with 8 screens, popular enough to stay busy most nights but small enough that you got to recognize the regular customers. We had people who came in every Friday for whatever new release was playing, others who only attended matinee showings, and a few who seemed to live at the theater, catching multiple shows per week. But there was one couple I started noticing who didn't fit any of the normal patterns. They showed up every Friday night for the 10 p.m. showing regardless of what movie was playing. Always the same seats, row J, seats 7 and 8. Always dressed formally like they were attending a special event. He wore a dark suit that looked expensive but old-fashioned, and she wore dresses that seemed to be from a different era, maybe the 1950s or 60s. At first, I assumed they were just movie enthusiasts with particular preferences about seating and scheduling. Some customers develop rigid routines about their theater experience, and management encourages us to accommodate regular patrons whenever possible. But their behavior was unusual in ways that gradually became more noticeable. They never spoke to each other, never bought concessions, and never seemed to interact with other customers. They'd arrive exactly 15 minutes before the show started, take their seats, and sit perfectly still throughout the entire film. No shifting positions, no whispering, no checking phones, just complete unnatural stillness. And they always left before the credits finished rolling. Not immediately when the movie ended, but during the final few minutes, like they were timing their departure to avoid the lobby crowds. I'd see them stand up simultaneously and walk out together, never looking back at the screen or acknowledging anyone around them. After noticing them for several weeks, I started paying more attention to their routine. They drove an older model car, something from the 1970s that looked like it had been maintained in perfect condition. They always parked in the same spot in the back corner of the lot, away from other vehicles in the main entrance lighting. What bothered me most was how other customers reacted to them. People sitting near row J would frequently move to different seats during the first few minutes of the movie, claiming they felt uncomfortable or that the temperature was wrong in that section. Parents with children would relocate their families without explanation. Even teenagers, who usually weren't sensitive to social dynamics, would avoid sitting in the rows directly behind or in front of the mysterious couple. It was like they had an invisible barrier around them that made other people instinctively want to maintain distance. About 6 weeks after I first noticed them, a customer came to me with a complaint that changed everything. It was a Friday night in October, and we were showing a popular horror film for the 10 p.m. slot. The theater was nearly full, which meant row J was surrounded by other moviegoers for once. About halfway through the film, a young woman approached me in the lobby, visibly upset. "There's a couple in my theater who won't stop whispering," she said. "They're saying horrible things, really disturbing stuff." I followed her back to Theater 5, where the horror film was playing. She pointed toward row J and whispered, "They're right there." I could see the couple clearly, same formal attire, same perfectly still posture, but row J was completely quiet. They weren't speaking, whispering, or making any sound that I could detect. "I don't hear anything," I told the customer. "They're doing it right now," she insisted. "The woman keeps describing what's going to happen to the people on screen before it happens." I listened carefully for several minutes, but row J remained silent. The couple sat motionless, staring at the screen, not speaking or interacting with anyone around them. I suggested. "No," she said firmly. "This is different. They're talking about people in the theater, describing them by name, mentioning things about their personal lives." She was genuinely frightened, not just annoyed by rude behavior. I offered to move her to a different section of the theater, which she accepted gratefully, but the encounter left me confused and concerned. Over the next few weeks, similar complaints became more frequent. Customers sitting near row J would approach me during shows, reporting that the formal couple was whispering disturbing commentary throughout the films. But every time I investigated, the couple appeared to be completely silent and focused on the screen. The complaints were remarkably consistent, though. Multiple people described hearing the woman predict plot developments before they happened, and the man making personal observations about other customers that he couldn't possibly have known. One customer claimed the man had whispered her full name and home address. Another said the woman had described her childhood pet in detail. A third reported that the couple had discussed his recent divorce, mentioning specific details that weren't public knowledge. But whenever I observed row J directly, I saw nothing unusual. Just two well-dressed people watching movies in complete silence. I started checking the box office records to learn more about these mysterious customers. That's when I discovered something that didn't make sense. According to our computer system, no one had purchased tickets for row J, seats 7 and 8, in over a year. The seats showed as available for every screening, including the Friday night shows when I could clearly see the couple occupying them. I asked other staff members to verify what they were seeing, and everyone confirmed that row J, seats 7 and 8 were occupied every Friday night. But the computer insisted those seats were empty and available for purchase. I brought this discrepancy to the attention of our manager, Carol, who initially assumed it was a technical glitch with the ticketing system. Maybe they're buying tickets at the door with cash and we're not updating the seating chart properly, she suggested. But when we reviewed the door sales records and cash register receipts, there was no record of anyone purchasing tickets for those specific seats on any of the Friday nights in question, Carol asked. I was certain about what I was seeing, but Carol's suggestion made me realize I should observe the couple more carefully and systematically. The following Friday night, I positioned myself in Theater 5 before the 10 p.m. show started and watched row J throughout the entire film. The couple arrived at their usual time, 15 minutes before the show, and took their customary seats. But this time, I paid attention to details I'd overlooked before. They didn't seem to cast shadows in the same way other customers did. The emergency lighting created clear silhouettes of everyone else in the theater, but the couple's shapes were somehow less defined, more like suggestions of people than actual solid figures. And their clothing, which had looked formal and old-fashioned from a distance, appeared to be deteriorating when I observed it closely. The man's suit had holes and stains that weren't visible from the lobby. The woman's dress looked faded and torn, like it had been worn continuously for decades without cleaning or maintenance. But the most disturbing discovery was what happened when other customers tried to sit near them. A family of 4 had purchased tickets for row J, seats 1 through 4, which would have put them in the same row as the mysterious couple. When they arrived and attempted to take their seats, they walked directly through seats 7 and 8 as if no one was there. They showed no awareness of the couple, no acknowledgement that they were stepping around or between other people. They simply moved through the space and settled into their assigned seats. But from my perspective, I could clearly see the family sitting in the same row as the couple, with only a few empty seats separating them. That's when I understood that the couple weren't visible to most customers. Only some people could see them, and only some people could hear their whispered commentary during films. I was apparently one of the people who could see them, but I'd never been close enough to hear whatever they were saying to the customers who complained about their behavior. The next Friday, I decided to sit in row 1 directly behind the couple to see if I could hear what was frightening other moviegoers. The theater was showing a romantic drama, not the kind of film that typically generated complaints about disturbing commentary. I purchased a ticket for row 1, seat 8, which would put me directly behind the woman in the mysterious couple. They arrived at their usual time and took their customary seats. From my position 1 row back, I could see them more clearly than ever before, and the details were unsettling. Their skin had a waxy, artificial quality, like mannequins or wax museum figures. Their hair looked brittle and colorless, and their clothes were definitely from a different era. 1950s formal wear that had been maintained in impossible condition for decades. About 20 minutes into the film, they began speaking to each other in whispers so quiet I had to strain to hear them. "She's thinking about leaving him," the woman said, apparently referring to the female lead on screen. "She won't," the man replied. Their conversation continued throughout the film, providing commentary that seemed to anticipate the plot developments before they occurred on screen. But they weren't just predicting the movie. They were discussing the motivations and fears of the characters, with an intimacy that suggested they knew these people personally. Then about halfway through the film, their conversation shifted. "The woman behind us has been watching us," the man said without turning around. "She can see us clearly," the woman agreed. "She's curious about why we're here," the man continued. "She should be careful about her curiosity," the woman replied. They were talking about me, discussing my presence and motivations like I was a character in whatever story they were observing. But they hadn't turned around or given any indication they were aware of me beyond their whispered conversation. Then the woman began describing other people in the theater. "The man in row C is thinking about his ex-wife. The teenage couple in row F are planning to break up after the movie. The family in row H is having financial problems." She continued describing the personal lives and private thoughts of customers throughout the theater, providing details that no one could possibly know just from observation. And her descriptions were delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used to discuss the movie's plot. That's when I realized what was terrifying the customers who complained about the couple's behavior. They weren't just making random, disturbing comments. They were revealing people's deepest secrets and private fears, speaking them aloud during what should have been an escapist entertainment experience. As the film neared its end, the couple's conversation became more focused and intense. "She's still watching us," the man said. "She should understand that some questions are dangerous to ask," the woman replied. Then simultaneously, they both turned around to look directly at me. Their faces were even more unsettling up close. Pale skin with an unnatural smoothness, eyes that reflected the screen's light like glass marbles, and expressions that suggested intelligence but no warmth or humanity. "Hello, Ashley," the woman said, using my name even though I'd never introduced myself. "We appreciate your professional concern," the man added. They stared at me for several more seconds, and I felt like they were evaluating something about me, determining whether I posed a threat or represented an opportunity. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," the woman said finally. Then they both turned back to face the screen, resumed their perfectly still postures, and remained silent for the remainder of the film. When the credits began rolling, they stood up and walked out together just like always. But this time, as they passed my row, the woman leaned over and whispered something that I'll never forget. "We've been attending Friday night screenings since 1962. We have no intention of stopping now." I sat in the theater until the credits finished and the lights came up, trying to process what had just happened. The couple knew my name, knew I'd been observing them, and had made it clear that they considered the Friday night screenings to be their territory. When I returned to the lobby, I asked Carol if she had any records of regular customers from the early 1960s who might still be attending screenings. "The Grandview opened in 1959, she said. "Do you have any photographs from the early years?" Carol found a box of old publicity photos in the office storage closet. Most were standard promotional shots of the lobby and theater interiors, but one photograph caught my attention immediately. It was dated October 1962 and showed the grand reopening after a renovation. In the background, clearly visible among the crowd of formally dressed patrons, was the couple from row J. They looked exactly the same as they did now. Same clothes, same ages, same expressions. The photograph was 60 years old, but they hadn't changed at all. I quit my job at the Grandview the following week, claiming I'd found a position with better hours and pay. But really, I couldn't handle the knowledge that something not entirely human was attending every Friday night screening, and that I'd apparently drawn their attention by observing them too closely. I heard from a former coworker that the customer complaints about row J continued after I left, and that the theater had eventually stopped selling tickets for that entire row on Friday nights. Officially, they claimed the seats had mechanical problems and were awaiting repair. But I suspect management had realized the same thing I had, that some customers exist outside the normal parameters of ticket sales and customer service, and that the best approach is to accommodate their presence, rather than try to understand or eliminate it. I still go to movies occasionally, but never on Friday nights, and never at theaters that have been operating for more than a few decades. Because once you've had a conversation with customers who've been attending the same screening for 60 years without aging or changing, you realize that some movie theaters serve audiences that exist beyond normal human timelines, and some seats are permanently reserved for patrons who purchase their tickets with something other than money. I never recorded that. The date on the footage was next week. I stared at the screen, watching my future self deliver a warning about something I'd never heard of, something that apparently hadn't happened yet but would happen soon enough that I'd felt compelled to leave myself a message. The timestamp showed Tuesday, November 15th at 2:47 a.m. Today was November 8th. Working at the Starlight Cinema meant handling a variety of responsibilities beyond just selling tickets and cleaning theaters. I was part of a small staff that rotated duties. Sometimes I worked the box office, sometimes concessions, sometimes projection. And every Sunday morning, I sorted through the lost and found bin to organize items that customers had left behind during the previous week. The lost and found collection was always interesting. People leave behind all kinds of things during movies: phones, wallets, jewelry, keys, jackets, even prescription glasses. Most items were claimed within a few days, but some things sat in our bin for weeks or months before we donate them to charity or dispose of them appropriately. The Starlight was a small, independent theater in a college town, the kind of place where people came to see art films, documentaries, and classic movie revivals. Our customer base was generally responsible and attentive, so the lost and found rarely contained anything particularly valuable or mysterious. But one Sunday morning in November, I found something that didn't make sense. Among the usual collection of forgotten scarves and phone chargers, I discovered an unlabeled USB drive. It was a basic black flash drive, the kind you could buy at any electronics store, with no identifying marks or stickers to indicate who it belonged to. Out of curiosity, I decided to plug it into the office computer to see if I could identify the owner from whatever files were stored on it. The drive contained a single video file labeled Starlight Security 1115, with a timestamp indicating it was created the previous Friday evening. When I opened the file, I found myself looking at security footage from our theater. The camera angle showed the lobby area from the perspective of our main security camera, which recorded continuously during business hours and throughout the night. But according to the timestamp on the footage, the recording was from November 15th, a date that was still a week in the future. I checked the calendar on the computer to make sure I wasn't confused about what day it was. November 8th, the USB drive contained security footage dated November 15th, showing events that hadn't happened yet. That was impossible, but I kept watching the footage anyway, curious to see what it showed. The video displayed normal activity in the Starlight's lobby. I could see myself working the evening shift, handling ticket sales, interacting with customers, performing the routine tasks I did every day. Nothing unusual or out of place, just standard documentation of a typical evening at the theater. But as I watched more carefully, I noticed subtle differences from what I remembered about my recent shifts. The clothing I was wearing in the footage wasn't anything I recognized from my current wardrobe. The way I moved seemed slightly different, more confident or purposeful than I usually felt during work. And there were customers in the footage that I didn't remember serving, even though their interactions with me appeared normal and routine. About 20 minutes into the footage, something happened that made me stop breathing. I had never done that. I'd never looked at the security camera and delivered any kind of message, and I'd certainly never said anything about the basement. The Starlight had a basement level that housed storage areas, utility equipment, and some office space that wasn't used regularly. I went down there occasionally to retrieve supplies or check on maintenance issues, but there was nothing noteworthy or concerning about the basement that would prompt a warning. But in the footage, my future self had clearly felt it was important enough to leave a message for someone, presumably me, about avoiding the basement for some reason. I rewound the video and watched that moment several times, confirming that I was reading the message correctly and that it was definitely my own face delivering the warning. The rest of the footage showed normal activity, with no other obvious anomalies or unusual behavior. My future self completed the evening shift routine and locked up the theater at the usual time. The recording ended around midnight on November 15th. I spent the rest of Sunday morning trying to understand what I'd discovered. The most rational explanation was that someone had created fake security footage as a prank, using video editing software to make it look like I was delivering a message about the basement. But the quality and detail of the footage suggested it was genuine surveillance video, not a digital manipulation. Another possibility was that the date stamp was wrong, and this was actually footage from a previous shift that I'd forgotten about. But I was certain I'd never looked directly at the security camera and mouthed any kind of message. The most unsettling explanation was that the footage was exactly what it appeared to be, a recording of events that would happen the following week, somehow created and left in the lost and found for me to discover. I decided to research the USB drive itself to see if I could learn anything about its origin. The brand and model were common, available at dozens of local stores and online retailers. There were no fingerprints or other identifying marks that might indicate who had placed it in the lost and found bin. And none of my co-workers remembered seeing anyone drop off or leave behind a flash drive during the previous week. It was as if the device had materialized in our lost and found collection without any human intervention. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking constantly about the basement warning. I'd been working at the Starlight for 8 months and had never encountered anything dangerous or concerning in the basement areas. But my future self had apparently felt strongly enough about some basement-related threat to leave a recorded message. I started paying more attention to the basement during my regular duties, looking for anything that might justify a warning about avoiding the area. The basement level was divided into several sections: a storage room with extra promotional materials and seasonal decorations, a utility area with the building's heating and electrical systems, and a small office space that the manager used for paperwork and inventory management. Everything appeared normal and properly maintained. No structural problems, no safety hazards, no signs of intrusion or unusual activity. Just the typical basement areas you'd expect in any commercial building. But I noticed something I'd overlooked before. There was a section of the basement that I'd never accessed. Beyond the utility area, there was a heavy metal door with multiple locks that I didn't have keys for. I'd assumed it was just additional storage or maybe space that connected to the neighboring building. But now I wondered if there was something behind that door that might be relevant to my future self's warning. I asked the manager, Robert, about the locked section during my next shift. "It's just old storage," he said dismissively. "Been locked since before I started working here. The previous owner said it was foundation issues, structurally unsound." But his explanation didn't satisfy my growing curiosity. If the area was just empty storage with foundation problems, why would my future self warn against going into the basement at all? As November 15th approached, I found myself becoming increasingly anxious about what might happen that day. The footage had showed me working a normal evening shift, but something during that shift had prompted me to leave a warning message about the basement. I considered calling in sick for November 15th, thinking that avoiding work entirely might prevent whatever situation had caused my future self's concern. But I realized that if the footage was genuine, my absence might create even bigger problems. If future events depended on me being present to witness or prevent something, staying home could make things worse. On November 15th, I arrived for my evening shift determined to pay careful attention to everything that happened, especially anything related to the basement. The evening started normally. Typical customer flow for a Tuesday night, routine ticket sales and concessions, no unusual incidents or concerns. I wore the same clothes I'd seen in the footage and tried to recreate the normal activities I'd observed my future self performing. Around 8:30 p.m., Robert asked me to retrieve some promotional materials from basement storage. "We're getting a shipment of new release posters tomorrow," he said. This was it, the moment that would lead to whatever had prompted my basement warning. I went downstairs with my keyring and flashlight, knowing that in about 6 hours I would look at the security camera and mouth a warning about this exact situation. The basement storage room was exactly as I'd left it during my previous visits. Boxes of promotional materials, seasonal decorations, and the storage tubes Robert had requested. I gathered what I needed and was heading back upstairs when I heard something that made me stop. Sounds were coming from behind the locked metal door, not mechanical sounds like you'd expect from heating or electrical systems, but voices. Quiet conversation, like several people having a meeting or discussion in the restricted area. I approached the locked door and listened more carefully. The voices were clearer now. At least 3 different people talking about something that involved the theater's operations. But according to Robert, that area was supposed to be empty storage with structural problems. There shouldn't be anyone back there, and there certainly shouldn't be people having meetings in a space that was supposedly unsafe. I tried to hear what they were discussing, but the door was too thick and the conversation too quiet to make out specific words. But I could definitely hear multiple voices, both male and female, talking in the kind of tones people use for serious business discussions. That's when I realized what my future self had been trying to warn me about. The locked section of the basement wasn't empty storage. There were people using it for some kind of meetings or activities that management either didn't know about or was deliberately concealing from regular employees. I returned to the lobby with the promotional materials Robert had requested. But I didn't mention what I'd heard in the basement. Instead, I spent the rest of my shift thinking about what those voices might represent, and why my future self had felt it was dangerous for me to investigate further. Around 10:30 p.m., Robert left for the evening, leaving me alone to handle the final showing and closing procedures. That's when I heard footsteps coming from the basement. Multiple sets of footsteps moving through the lower level and heading toward the stairs that led to the lobby. The people who'd been meeting behind the locked door were apparently finished with whatever they'd been discussing. I positioned myself behind the ticket counter where I could observe the basement stairwell without being immediately visible to anyone coming upstairs. 3 people emerged from the basement, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in business attire and carrying briefcases or folders. They looked like they could be real estate agents, lawyers, or some other kind of professional service providers. But I'd never seen them before, and they certainly weren't customers who had attended any of the evening's screenings. They walked through the lobby like they were familiar with the building, heading directly toward the front entrance without acknowledging my presence or showing any surprise at finding someone working at the ticket counter. As they reached the front doors, one of the men turned back and looked at me directly. "Good evening, Marcus," he said. I hadn't told them my name, and I'd never seen this person before in my life. But he knew who I was and apparently expected me to keep quiet about whatever meeting had just taken place downstairs. "We'll be back next Tuesday for our regular session," the woman added. They left through the front entrance, and I watched through the window as they got into expensive cars and drove away. I spent the rest of my shift trying to understand what I'd witnessed. The Starlight was apparently being used for some kind of regular meetings by people who had access to restricted areas of the building. These meetings occurred without the knowledge or presence of regular management, and the participants expected employees to maintain confidentiality about their activities. I was leaving a message for my past self, knowing that in a week I would find it on a USB drive in the Lost and Found collection. But I still didn't understand how the recording had been created or how it had ended up in our Lost and Found bin before the events it documented had actually occurred. The next morning, I checked the office computer to see if the previous night's security footage had been recorded normally. But the files for November 15th were missing from our system. The camera had been running, but somehow the data hadn't been saved to our regular storage. A week later, while sorting through the Lost and Found collection, I found another unlabeled USB drive containing security footage dated November 22nd. This recording showed me discovering the second USB drive and watching footage of events that hadn't happened yet. I realized I was trapped in some kind of temporal loop, receiving warnings about future events that I would then experience and record warnings about for my past self. The basement meetings continued every Tuesday night. I learned to avoid the lower level during those times, and the mysterious participants continued to acknowledge my discretion with polite nods and occasional thanks. But I never learned who they were, what they were meeting about, or how they'd gained access to restricted areas of the theater. I quit my job at the Starlight 3 weeks later, unable to handle the stress of receiving advance warnings about events I couldn't prevent or fully understand. But sometimes I wonder if my replacement has found USB drives in the Lost and Found collection, containing security footage of events that haven't happened yet, along with warnings about avoiding the basement on Tuesday nights. And I wonder if there are other buildings, other jobs where employees discover recordings of their future selves delivering warnings about situations they don't yet understand, trapped in cycles of temporal messages that loop backward through time, to provide information that can't be used to change what's already been determined to happen. Because once you've seen proof that the future can record messages for the past, you realize that some warnings arrive too late to prevent the very events they're meant to help you avoid.